All hell is breaking loose. And this time, it is not just breaking loose in the Middle East. It is breaking loose inside the coalition that Donald Trump told the world was forming around him. Look, Trump went on Truth Social on Saturday. He went to the Wall Street Journal on Sunday. He told everyone who would listen that many countries had agreed to send warships to the Strait of Hormuz and that China, France, Japan, South Korea, and the United Kingdom were all on board. You want to know how many of those countries have publicly committed to sending a single naval vessel as of right now, March 16th, 2026? Zero. Not one. The grand coalition that was going to reopen the world's most critical oil choke point has a total troop count of 0 ships from 0 countries. And while that beautiful coalition was busy not existing, the average American woke up this morning and paid $3.72 for a gallon of gas. That is 79 cents more per gallon than they paid exactly 1 month ago, according to the 8AA Motor Club. 79 cents in 30 days. That is not a projection. That is already at the pump. And what I found when I went through the IEA document, the Goldman Sachs report, and the German Defense Ministry statement, all three together, is worse than any headline you have seen about this story today. Way worse. Because when you put those three documents side by side, they tell a single story that this administration absolutely does not want told. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications. This story is moving by the hour, and the next 72 hours are going to be critical. You need to be here when it breaks. Let me walk you through exactly how we got here, because this did not happen overnight, and it sure as hell was not unforeseeable. 14 months ago, Trump takes office and immediately starts torching every alliance America spent 80 years building, attacking NATO members, slapping tariffs on allied nations, publicly humiliating their leaders on camera. 12 months ago, Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard testifies to Congress that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon. 10 months ago, Trump is praising Israeli strikes on Iran as excellent and very successful. 6 months ago, Trump is publicly mocking the supreme leader of Iran, telling him on social media, "Tell the truth, you got beat to hell." 3 months ago, Trump is openly floating regime change as the objective. Then, on February 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched joint strikes on Iran. Supreme Leader Ali Hosseini Khamenei is killed in the opening hours. On March 2nd, Iran declares the Strait of Hormuz closed. 16 commercial vessels have been attacked since then, according to UK Maritime Trade Operations. Then this morning, Trump posts on Truth Social that the coalition is coming together, and every single country he named is either publicly saying no or saying absolutely nothing. Then this morning, the announcement. Now let's get into the document that the mainstream coverage is too busy with the politics to actually read, because this is where the real story is. The International Energy Agency, this is not an op-ed, this is the nonpartisan body that governments across the world use to make actual energy policy decisions, released its March oil market report this week. And here is what it says. The war in the Middle East is creating the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Not one of the largest in the history of the global oil market. The document confirms that crude and oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz have plunged from approximately 20 million barrels per day before the war to what the IEA describes as a trickle currently. Then go to the section of the same document that covers the emergency reserve release, that 400 million barrel announcement that was presented to the public like it was going to fix everything. The IEA document states that at normal Hormuz flow rates, 400 million barrels represents approximately 20 days of typical Hormuz traffic. 20 days, not a solution. A bridge. A 20-day bridge, and that assumes the oil actually reaches markets within the 13-day pipeline delay the document describes. Read that again. That changes this. Because 400 million barrels was announced like cavalry was arriving, and the document that governments actually use to make policy says it is 20 days of bridge maximum, and it started burning the moment they announced it. I want to stay on one specific word from German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius, because it is the most important word any official has said in this entire crisis, and nobody is paying attention to it. On Monday, March 16th, 2026, Pistorius is asked about Trump's NATO threats. Trump told the Financial Times that NATO would face a very bad future if allies did not join the coalition. Okay? That is a threat. That is a direct threat to the alliance. And Boris Pistorius, the defense minister of Germany, looks at that threat and says in Berlin, "This is not our war. We have not started it." That word started is doing massive legal work right there. Pistorius did not say this is not our region. He did not say we have legal complications. He specifically said we have not started it. And that is a direct invocation of what the NATO Charter actually says, which is that Article 5 mutual defense applies when an ally is attacked, and not when an ally launches an offensive war of choice and then expects everyone else to show up afterward. Pistorius was not being diplomatic. He was publicly stating on the record that in Germany's legal reading, the United States cannot use NATO to demand solidarity for a war the United States itself started. That is not hedging. That is a legal argument. I have to be fair here. The other side has a point, several points, actually. The first comes from Elizabeth Saunders, professor of political science at Georgetown University, who argued this week in Foreign Policy that European reluctance partly reflects decades of failure by those same governments to build energy independence. If Germany had developed sufficient LNG import capacity years ago, they would have less at stake and more credibility to criticize. That is a fair point, and it should be said. The second comes from the Trump administration itself. National Security Council spokesperson Brian Hughes stated Monday that every country that benefits from Hormuz trade has a shared responsibility to protect it, and that the United States has disproportionately funded global security for decades. That argument has real historical weight, and it is not wrong. The third comes from former Deputy National Security Advisor Matthew Pottinger, writing in Foreign Affairs this week, arguing that the strategic logic of eliminating Iran's nuclear capabilities before completion was sound, regardless of diplomatic context, and that the chaos afterward does not retroactively invalidate the military objective. But here is where I have to be direct. All three of those arguments require this war to end quickly. And guess what? The IEA does not assume it ends quickly. Goldman Sachs does not assume it ends quickly. And Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi told CBS News on Sunday, March 15th, 2026, "We have never asked for a ceasefire, and we have never asked even for negotiation. That is not a country preparing to end a war quickly. That is not ambiguity. That is the Iranian foreign minister going on American television and saying point blank, we are not talking to you and we are not stopping." On the same day, Donald Trump was telling reporters Iran was not ready for a deal yet, implying talks were happening. There are no talks. Let's be very clear about that. Zero talks. The Iranian foreign minister had to go on American media to explain to Americans that their own president is lying to them about whether negotiations are occurring. Think about that for a second. Let me draw the direct line from the Strait of Hormuz to your household, because this is where it gets personal real fast. Start at the pump. The average gallon of gasoline cost $2.93 on February 27th, 2026, the day before the strikes, according to AID-AA historical data. Today, it costs $3.72. That is 79 cents more per gallon in 16 days. The average American household uses roughly 33 gallons of gas per month. That is $26 more per month right now just on fuel. But fuel is just the entry point. Walk the chain forward. According to the IEA March report and an analysis by American Farm Bureau economists cited in Time magazine this week, Gulf states produce nearly 49% of global urea exports. And urea is the nitrogen fertilizer that American corn and soybean farmers put in the ground in the spring before planting. Urea prices have already risen 35% since February 28th, 35%, and spring planting season in the American Midwest starts in 4 to 6 weeks. Farmers are buying that fertilizer right now, this week, at prices 35% higher than before this war began. That decision gets made this week. That harvest comes to market in October. The price of corn, bread, cooking oil, and everything derived from those crops this fall is not a prediction anymore. It is a mathematical consequence of a decision being made right now by American farmers who have no choice. And on top of that, Goldman Sachs economists Manuel Abacassis and David Maracle raised their 2026 United States recession odds to 25%, a 5-point jump in a single report. And Oxford Economics modeled a scenario where oil averages $140 a barrel for 2 months and found the Eurozone, the UK, and Japan enter contraction while the United States hits what they call economic standstill, 79 cents at the pump, 26 extra dollars a month on gas, 35% more for the fertilizer that grows your food, 1 in in 4 chance of recession. That chain started February 28th in Washington, D.C. Let me tell you what the named expert community is now agreeing on, because the convergence is striking and it is coming from every direction. Andreas Krieg, Middle East security expert at King's College London's School of Security Studies, told Al Jazeera this week that Trump's coalition request appears to mask the absence of a broader plan, and described the whole coalition campaign as a desperate move in an information campaign to calm markets. That is a security analyst at a major Western institution publicly saying the administration was improvising. Goldman Sachs economists Abakaisis and Miracle raised United States recession odds by 5 points in a single document. And this is the same Goldman Sachs that spent years arguing the U.S. economy was durable. A 5-point jump in a week from Goldman is not routine. Heron Lim, economics lecturer at ESSEC Business School, told Time magazine this week that even if ships reroute, the geography makes alternatives impractical for the volume of trade that normally passes through Hormuz. And General Sir Nick Carter, former Chief of Defense Staff of the United Kingdom, told the BBC that NATO is not an alliance that was designed for one of the allies to go on a war of choice and then oblige everyone else to follow. The former head of British Defense saying the foundational premise of Trump's coalition demand is incompatible with how the alliance actually operates. A security expert at King's College, Goldman Sachs economists, an economic lecturer at ESSEC, and the former Chief of Defense Staff of the United Kingdom. 4 institutions, 4 different frameworks, one shared conclusion: no plan, no coalition, and the economic consequences are already running. When professionals across the entire ideological spectrum converge on the same assessment, that convergence is the most reliable signal available. Here is what nobody in mainstream coverage is saying out loud. Donald Trump told the Wall Street Journal a coalition was forming. He told Truth Social many countries agreed. He told PBS on Monday the war would end soon. Meanwhile, the German defense minister said publicly, "This is not our war." The UK said it will not be drawn into the wider war. Japan said it has made no decisions whatsoever. Australia said it is not sending ships. France said none. Greece said no military operations. Italy said it is not involved in any naval missions. Trump named 7 countries. Every single one refused publicly or made zero commitment. And Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi told CBS News directly, "We have never asked for a ceasefire and never asked for negotiation," directly contradicting Trump's own public statement on the same day. There are no talks. The coalition does not exist. The emergency reserves cover 20 days. The IEA, Goldman Sachs, the U.S. Energy Information Administration, and the former Chief of British Defense have all, in their different technical vocabularies, said the same thing. The gap between what this administration is telling the public and what the documents show is not spin. It is a matter of documented record. The closest historical parallel is not Iraq in 2003. The structural logic maps more precisely to the Suez Crisis of 1956. In October of that year, the United Kingdom and France, in coordination with Israel, launched military strikes on Egypt to retake control of the Suez Canal after Nasser nationalized it. The mechanism is identical to what is happening right now. A Western power launched offensive military operations against a regional state to control a critical shipping waterway without consulting major allies, and then expected those allies to fall in line afterward. President Eisenhower refused, not because he loved Nasser, he did not, but because the unilateral use of force without coalition consensus violated the rules-based framework the United States itself had built. The UK and France were forced to withdraw in humiliation. The structural logic in 2026 is identical in these specific ways. United States launches offensive operations against a regional state to control a critical waterway without advance allied consultation. Those allies are now publicly refusing to validate the action after the fact. The economic consequences are being borne by countries that had zero input into the decision, and the initiating power is demanding solidarity from allies it spent years systematically humiliating. In 1956, Suez ended Britain's role as a primary global power permanently. The question this crisis raises, and that nobody is asking out loud on, is what it will permanently shift toward. Here are the 5 specific things you need to watch in the days ahead. By Thursday, March 19th, Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi visits the White House. Trump has made clear this visit is about pressuring Japan to join the coalition. Japan's laws strictly limit overseas military deployments, and Takaichi told Parliament this week they have made no decisions whatsoever. Watch whether Takaichi makes any public commitment on Thursday. If Japan leaves Washington without a public commitment, the coalition effort will have failed its most important diplomatic test on the record. On Thursday, March 20th, the EU Council meets in Brussels. Germany, France, Greece, and Italy have all individually used the phrase outside international law or refused participation. If the EU as an institution formalizes that language collectively on March 20th, it will be the first time in history that the entire European Union has placed itself in formal documented opposition to an active United States military operation. Watch the AAA weekly gas price report due Friday, March 21st. Current price is $3.72. Goldman Sachs modeled $4 as the threshold where consumer confidence begins accelerating downward. If it crosses $4 before Friday, that number becomes the dominant political story, regardless of any military development that week. Watch whether Iran issues any statement in the coming days using the word conditions rather than tool in reference to the strait closure. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, described the closure as a tool to pressure the enemy. A shift to conditions language would be the first documented signal that Iran is identifying terms for reopening. 16 days in with no such shift. That absence is itself data. And watch whether the United States Congress schedules any war authorization vote. This war has been running for 16 days. No congressional authorization has been sought, none has been scheduled, and the Constitution requires it. If the Speaker of the House says nothing about a war powers vote this week, that silence has meaning. Here's where things stand tonight based only on confirmed sourced facts. The United States and Israel launched joint strikes on Iran on February 28, 2026. Supreme Leader Ali Hosseini Khamenei was killed. 16 commercial vessels have been attacked in the Strait of Hormuz region since then, according to UK Maritime Trade Operations. Brent crude stands at $101.93 per barrel as of Monday, according to FactSet. The average gallon of gasoline costs $3.72 today, according to RAA, 79 cents more than 1 month ago. The IEA has released 400 million barrels from emergency reserves representing 20 days of normal Hormuz flow. Goldman Sachs has raised United States recession odds to 25%. 0 countries have publicly committed to Trump's naval coalition request. What is not yet confirmed is whether any back-channel diplomatic communication exists between Washington and Tehran, whether any country will make a public coalition commitment before or after the Japanese prime ministerial visit on Thursday, and whether the EU Council on March 20th will formalize individual member state positions into a collective institutional document. The outcome of each of those 3 unknowns will determine whether the trajectory Goldman Sachs and Oxford Economics are modeling accelerates or pauses. My prediction, and I want you to hold me to this, by March 23rd, the Trump administration will announce a coalition exists and will name at least 2 countries as participants without those countries making independent public confirmation. Watch whether the named countries confirm it themselves within 48 hours. If they do not confirm independently, that silence tells you everything about the nature of that coalition. The question I am leaving you with tonight is this: when a president spends 4 years systematically destroying every alliance his country built over 80 years, starts a war nobody asked for, and then goes to those same allies hat in hand demanding they send their sailors and their ships to clean it up, and every single one of them says no. At what point does America First become the official historical documentation of how a superpower chose to be alone? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one. Subscribe, turn on notifications. When the next development breaks, I will be here, document by document, statement by statement, the way this story deserves to be covered.